We'll labor, we'll cook, we'll do all you ask. Just don't leave us outside," cried the lost sisters. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The storm rolled down from the mountains like a living beast, howling through the valley and rattling the shutters of a lonely cedar cabin. Snowflakes struck against the window pane, thick and relentless, blurring the world into white. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth crackled, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Elias Crow sat at his table, his hands steady as he drew a whetstone along the edge of his hunting knife. The sound was rhythmic, calming, scrape, scrape, scrape. For years, silence had been his only companion. He had chosen this solitude after too many battles, too much loss, and a world that no longer fit him. But tonight, that silence was broken. A knock, sharp, urgent. Elias froze, his grip tightening around the knife. Visitors were nearly unheard of here. No one braved the mountains in winter unless forced. His blue-gray eyes darted toward the door. For a long moment, the only sounds were the storm outside and the pounding of his own heart. Then it came again, louder, more desperate. With slow precision, Elias set down the knife and reached for the rifle propped against the wall. He stood, his boots thudding softly against the floorboards, and approached the door. His instincts whispered caution, a trap perhaps, or strangers who might mean him harm. Yet the raw urgency in that knock carried something else. Desperation. Elias unlatched the door and pulled it open. The wind howled in, carrying snow and cold that stung his skin. Standing on the porch were three figures, huddled together against the storm. They were young women, sisters by the look of them, their faces sharing the same sharp cheekbones and dark, searching eyes. Their clothes were ragged, patched and torn, soaked from snow. Their hands trembled, and their lips were blue from cold. The eldest stood at the front, her long hair tangled and dusted with ice. She was perhaps 26, her frame lean but upright, her pride refusing to bow even as the storm threatened to crush her. Her arms were bruised, her knuckles scraped raw, but her gaze did not waver. Behind her stood the middle sister, a little younger, with sharper eyes that never rested. She looked Elias up and down, as though assessing him. A man alone, a stranger who could be either salvation or ruin. She had the stance of someone ready to fight for her family if she had to. The youngest, no older than 19, clung to her sisters, shivering violently. Her bare feet pressed into the snow, split at the heels, her lips trembling not only from the cold but from fear. Yet even in her weakness, she stared at Elias with something her sisters did not. Hope God it was the eldest who finally spoke. Her voice was rough, cracking from thirst and exhaustion, but carried the strength of command. "We'll labor. We'll cook. We'll do all you ask," she pleaded. "Just don't leave us outside." Her words hung in the air, mingling with the storm. Elias studied them in silence. He had seen faces like this before, refugees of raids, wanderers driven from homes, survivors of cruelty. He knew what kind of world cast people into the snow with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Letting them in meant more mouths to feed, more danger if raiders or townsfolk came searching. He had built this life of isolation for a reason, survival. But looking into their eyes, the eldest's steady defiance, the middle's guarded suspicion, the youngest's fragile hope, he felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him. A man could shut the door and silence the knocking forever, or he could open it, and everything in his life would change. For a long, heavy moment, the storm seemed to pause, waiting on his decision. Elias's jaw tightened. Then, with a simple nod, he stepped aside and pulled the door wider. "Inside," he said. The sisters moved quickly, stepping into the warmth, their breath fogging the air as they crossed the threshold. The firelight bathed their faces, revealing more than the storm had hidden: exhaustion, hunger, but also determination. Elias closed the door against the storm. The cabin, once filled only with the crackle of fire and the scrape of steel, now held new voices, new burdens, and perhaps new beginnings. The silence of his solitude had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The door shut with a hollow thud, sealing out the roar of the storm. For a moment, all four of them just stood there. Elias on one side of the room, the three sisters on the other, dripping snow onto the wooden floor. The firelight painted their faces, showing just how worn they were. Their cheeks were hollow, their lips cracked, and their hands trembled not only from cold but from weakness. The youngest nearly collapsed, her knees buckling before the middle sister caught her and lowered her gently onto a rug near the fire. Elias leaned his rifle against the wall but did not relax. He remained by the table, his stance guarded. He was a man used to silence, a man who trusted no one easily. And yet, as he studied them, he couldn't help noticing the details. The bruises on the eldest's arms, the cracked skin on the youngest's feet, the way the middle one hid her pain but winced when she lifted her sister. These were not wanderers by choice. The eldest broke the silence first. Her voice was low, deliberate. "We don't want your charity," she said. "We can earn our place here. Whatever you ask, we'll do it." Elias gave no answer. He moved toward the small shelf by the hearth and pulled down a sack of dried beans along with a strip of salted venison. Without a word, he placed them on the table. His gesture was plain: food. The middle sister wasted no time. She rose, her movement steady despite exhaustion, and took command of the pot hanging over the fire. She filled it with water, broke the venison into pieces, and poured in the beans. The smell soon began to fill the room, rich and comforting against the bitter cold pressing at the walls. The youngest stirred, sitting up slowly. Her wide eyes followed every movement of the pot as if it were a miracle. When the stew finally bubbled and thickened, the middle sister ladled it into 4 bowls. She handed one to Elias first, her face unreadable, as if testing him. Elias stared at the steaming food, then slid the bowl back across the table. "Yours," he said flatly. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the youngest's trembling hand reached forward. She accepted the bowl reverently, as though she had been handed a treasure. She ate slowly, her eyes closing with relief at the first taste of warmth in days. The eldest and middle sister followed, each eating with quiet restraint, never rushing, never taking more than they should. Elias noted that they left the fullest portion for the youngest, who needed it most. The room fell into silence again, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. Elias sat back in his chair, arms folded, watching. He wasn't just feeding strangers. He was weighing them. Were they trustworthy? Would they bring trouble? Could he afford to keep them here? When the bowls were emptied, the middle sister rinsed them carefully and placed them back on the shelf without being told. The eldest gathered the blankets Elias had thrown near the hearth earlier and spread them neatly across the floor. She guided her younger sisters to lie down, though she herself remained sitting upright, watchful, her eyes flicking toward Elias now and then, the fire dimmed to embers, shadows stretching long across the cabin walls. Elias remained at the table, sharpening a broken axe handle, pretending to focus on his task but listening closely. The storm raged for 3 more days without pause. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, sealing them off from the outside world. Inside, Elias kept to his habits, rising early, tending the fire, checking his tools, and sharpening blades. But now he was no longer alone. On the first morning when he stepped out of his small sleeping corner, he expected to find the sisters huddled still beneath blankets. Instead, he stopped short. The eldest was already awake, standing near the hearth with a blanket wrapped over her shoulders. She gave him a brief nod, cautious, respectful, but not submissive. The middle sister was on her knees scrubbing the floorboards with a rag, wiping away the dried snow they had tracked in. The youngest, barefoot again despite the boots he had given her, was clumsily stacking firewood near the wall, her breath puffing in small white clouds from the cold air that slipped through the cabin's cracks. Elias narrowed his eyes. He hadn't asked them to do anything. Yet here they were, moving with quiet purpose, as though proving they belonged. "You don't need," he began. The eldest cut him off with calm firmness. "We said we'd work." She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words silenced him. Elias gave a slow nod and said nothing more. By mid-morning, the middle sister had taken command of the cooking again. Elias watched as she measured beans with practiced precision, stretching what little he had left into something filling. She moved like someone who had done this for years, her hands confident, her eyes calculating every portion. When she slid a bowl toward Elias, he noticed she had served him equal to them, not less, not more. A fair share. He ate in silence, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. After the meal, Elias pulled on his coat and hat to head outside. The snow was knee-deep, and the fence line that kept predators away from his small corral had taken a beating. Normally, this was solitary work. But today, as he stepped outside with a hammer and a bundle of nails, he heard footsteps behind him. It was the eldest. She had wrapped herself in a wool shawl and followed without asking permission. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice carrying above the wind. "Fixing what's mine," Elias replied flatly. Without another word, she bent to lift one of the fence posts that had tilted under the weight of snow. She struggled at first, her frame was lean, and the post was heavy. But she adjusted her grip, braced her feet, and lifted again, this time steady. Elias hammered the post back into place, his eyes flicking to her. She met his gaze with quiet determination, her breath fogging in the cold air. By the time they returned inside, her hands were raw and red, but she made no complaint. The middle sister immediately noticed and fetched a cloth, dabbing the eldest's skin with melted snow to soothe the burns. "You don't need to do his work," the middle sister muttered. The eldest's answer was simple. "We said we'd earn our place." Elias didn't interrupt, but as he sat back at the table, watching them tend to each other, he felt something shift inside him. These women weren't just passers-by waiting out a storm. They were survivors, workers, people who had known loss but refused to be broken. That evening, after supper, the youngest curled up closest to the fire, humming softly to herself. The middle sister sat nearby, sewing a tear in one of Elias's blankets with nimble fingers. The eldest, still sore from the cold, remained seated upright, her dark eyes fixed on Elias as he carved a piece of wood into the shape of a handle. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her steady gaze said enough. "We keep our word. We work. But we are watching you too." Elias felt the weight of her silent challenge. He gave no smile, no nod, no reassurance. But he didn't look away either. In that small cabin, as the wind howled outside, a fragile balance was forming, one built on caution, respect, and the slow, tentative beginnings of trust. The storm finally broke on the fifth morning. Sunlight glared off endless fields of snow, turning the world into a blinding white. Elias pushed open the cabin door and squinted, his breath fogging as the crisp air hit his lungs. For a long time, he simply stood there, staring at the quiet wilderness. Behind him, the sisters stirred. The youngest bounded to his side, her bare feet crunching softly against the wooden floor. She tugged on the sleeve of his coat. "It looks like sugar," she whispered, wide-eyed at the glittering snow. Elias didn't answer. He didn't know how to answer. Children were foreign to him, their wonder an alien thing. Yet something in the way her blue eyes reflected the morning sun made him hesitate before shutting the door again, that day. With the storm past, the sisters insisted on helping more. The middle one gathered water from the stream, breaking through the ice with careful strikes. The eldest helped Elias dig out the shed, shoveling snow until her arms shook. Even the youngest carried small bundles of firewood, her face red from the cold but proud of her effort. By evening, the cabin felt different. Less like a place of isolation and more like a home with voices and movement. Elias sat at the table sharpening his knife, listening as the middle sister hummed softly while stirring a pot of stew. The youngest played with a piece of string, turning it into patterns between her fingers. The eldest mended a tear on her shawl, her steady hands working by the firelight. Elias glanced at them one by one. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard a woman's voice linger in his cabin longer than a passing visit. Nor could he recall laughter, faint though it was, filling these walls. It unsettled him, but not in a way he wanted to chase off. Later, after supper, the youngest asked him a question. "Why do you live here all alone?" The words caught him off guard. His knife stilled in his hands. The sisters turned to look at him, waiting for an answer. Elias cleared his throat. "Because I chose it. Why?" The child pressed, tilting her head. He didn't owe them an explanation. Yet the fire crackled, the stew scent lingered, and their eyes, curious, patient, pinned him in place. "Too much noise out there," he finally muttered. "Too many people with too many lies. Here, I know what's mine." "What's real?" The eldest studied him carefully. "And what about trust? Do you believe in that?" Elias's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "Trust gets you killed if you're not careful." The room grew quiet at that. The sisters exchanged glances but said nothing more. That night, as they settled into their corners, the youngest curled under a blanket near the fire. She fidgeted, restless, until finally she whispered into the dim cabin, "Thank you for not leaving us outside." Elias, lying on his cot, stared at the ceiling beams. He didn't respond, but the words lingered, pressing against the walls he had built around himself. The following days followed a rhythm: work, meals, rest. Slowly, Elias's silence softened. He found himself giving short instructions, offering tools without being asked, even correcting the youngest gently instead of with his usual coldness. The sisters, in turn, treated his home with care, never overstepping, never demanding. The bond forming between them was unspoken, fragile, yet undeniable. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. It carried the sounds of life, the scrape of a needle through cloth, the bubbling of stew, the quiet laughter of sisters who had endured much yet still found ways to smile. And though Elias would never admit it aloud, part of him began to dread the moment when the snow would melt, and the path to the world outside would open again. The days slipped by, measured not by calendars or clocks, but by the rhythm of chores and the crackling of the fire. Outside, snow still covered the valley in a thick, white blanket, but the storm had eased into silence. Inside the cabin, warmth grew not only from the hearth but from something more fragile, the comfort of routine. Elias still kept his distance, speaking little, but the sharp edge in his voice had dulled. The sisters, cautious at first, had learned how far they could push, when to remain quiet, when to ask questions, when to leave the man alone with his thoughts. One evening, after supper, the youngest drifted to sleep by the fire, her head pillowed on her sister's lap. The middle sister hummed softly, brushing the child's hair with her fingers. The eldest, however, sat upright, her gaze fixed on Elias as he cleaned his rifle by lamplight. It was she who broke the silence. "You've been alone a long time." Elias didn't look up. "That's not a question. It wasn't meant to be." Her voice was steady, but behind it lingered curiosity. Elias knew that tone. He'd heard it before from travelers and neighbors, the probing interest in who he was, what had driven him to solitude. Normally, he'd shut it down with a glare or a clipped remark. But something in the eldest sister's eyes made him pause. She wasn't prying for gossip. She wanted to understand. "I've been alone because people take," he said finally, his voice low. "They promise loyalty, they promise care. But in the end, they leave or they betray or they die. Solitude doesn't lie." The middle sister stopped humming, her hand stilling on the child's hair. The eldest tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Loss makes cowards of some," she murmured, "and walls around others." Elias's eyes flicked to her, sharp but not angry. "And which am I?" She held his gaze without flinching. "A man who's not sure which he wants to be." The words struck deeper than he expected. He turned back to his rifle, but his hands moved slower now, his thoughts unsettled. The silence stretched until the middle sister spoke, her voice softer, almost hesitant. "We lost people too." Elias's head lifted slightly. He hadn't asked about their past, hadn't wanted to know. But the middle sister continued, "We had a home. Not a grand one, but it was ours. Then sickness came through the village. Took our parents, our brothers, even the little ones." Her voice faltered, but she steadied it. "We survived because we had no choice," the eldest added, "and because no one else would keep us." The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Elias studied their faces, the quiet strength in the eldest, the tenderness in the middle, the innocent vulnerability of the youngest. Their survival hadn't been luck. It had been grit and pain and sacrifice. "You carry that weight," Elias said gruffly. "As do you," the eldest returned. He didn't argue. He couldn't. The youngest stirred then, half asleep, mumbling words that made the others smile faintly. Elias looked away quickly, back to his rifle. But the image of them, a family bound not by blood anymore, but by survival, lingered in his mind. Later, when the sisters had settled into their blankets, Elias remained awake, staring into the flames. Their confession stirred memories he had buried. A woman's laugh, a child's cry, a grave marked under a lonely tree. He clenched his jaw, forcing the past back into its cage. But now, for the first time in years, he wasn't the only one carrying ghosts in the cabin. And somehow, knowing that eased the burden. The storm had ended, but winter still gripped the land. Days were shorter now, nights long and cold. The sisters had fallen into rhythm with Elias, chopping wood, fetching water, mending clothes, and cooking meals. It was almost beginning to feel steady. Almost safe. But safety in the wilderness was always an illusion. One afternoon, Elias went out to check the snares he had set in the woods. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the air was sharp in his lungs. The sisters remained at the cabin, promising to keep the fire alive until he returned. He didn't expect to be gone long. Yet as he followed the tracks, his gut told him something was wrong. His snares had been tripped, not by animals, but by human hands. The cords were cut, the traps ruined. He crouched low, his hand brushing the snow where footprints pressed deep. Not one pair, two, maybe three. His jaw tightened. Strangers. When Elias returned to the cabin, the youngest was humming near the fire, the middle sister kneading dough, and the eldest was mending one of his shirts. They looked up as he pushed through the door, his face dark. "What is it?" The eldest asked immediately. "Tracks," he said, hanging his rifle by the door. Men, too close. The middle sister's hands stilled on the dough. The youngest blinked, her hum fading into silence. "Bandits?" The eldest pressed. "Could be." Elias's tone was clipped, but the fire in his eyes was sharp. "Could be worse." That night, no one slept easily. Elias sat up with his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the door. The sisters huddled together under blankets, whispering quietly among themselves what had happened on the second night. The sound of crunching snow outside woke Elias instantly. He motioned for silence, his hand raised. The sisters froze, their eyes wide. The youngest clutched her eldest sister's arm. Elias crept to the window, peering out. Shadows moved between the trees, two figures, maybe three. He couldn't see their faces, but he didn't need to. Strangers in the snow meant trouble. A voice called out, rough and mocking. "Ho there, cabin folk. Got room for a few tired travelers?" Another laugh followed, sharp and unfriendly. Elias didn't answer. He knew men like these. They didn't come seeking warmth. They came seeking to take. The eldest sister moved closer to him, whispering low. "What do we do?" Elias didn't turn. "You stay quiet. If they try the door, I'll deal with it." The middle sister's hand trembled against her skirt. The youngest whimpered softly, muffled by her sister's shawl. The voices outside grew louder, circling. A knock thundered on the door, rattling the hinges. "Open up." We saw smoke. "Don't be rude." Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. But before he could move, the eldest touched his arm. "Don't kill unless you must," she whispered. Her eyes locked on his, steady but pleading. "If you spill blood, more may come looking." It was a test. Not of his aim, but of his judgment. Could he protect them without falling into the violence that had defined so much of his past? The men outside pounded again. "Last chance." Elias took a breath, then barked out in a voice hard as iron. "This cabin's mine. There's no food here for thieves. Walk away while you still can." Silence. Then curses spat into the cold air. Footsteps stomped back through the snow, fading into the trees. For a long moment, no one moved. The fire crackled. The sisters held their breath. Finally, Elias lowered his rifle, though his hands were still tense. The eldest exhaled first. "You spared them." Elias didn't answer. He set the rifle back by the door and sat down heavily. The youngest, still trembling, crawled close to him without a word. She leaned against his arm, small and fragile. He didn't push her away. Trust, fragile and unsteady, had been tested that night. And though the danger wasn't gone, the sisters saw something new in Elias's restraint. A man not only capable of violence, but of choosing not to use it. The days after the stranger's visit carried a strange weight. Elias checked the traps more often, patrolled the fence line twice a day, and kept his rifle close even inside the cabin. The sisters, sensing his unease, moved more quietly, as though unwilling to stir whatever storm brewed in his mind. But even in that tension, something had shifted. The youngest no longer looked at Elias with fear. She followed him around like a shadow, trailing behind when he fetched water or split logs. At first, Elias grunted and waved her off. But she always came back, smiling up at him with her gap-toothed grin, asking questions about the axe, the snares, the trees. Why did the birds leave in winter? She asked once, her little hands cupped around snow she'd gathered. To survive, Elias said simply, striking his axe into a log. Then why don't you leave? The question caught him mid-swing. He froze, the axe lodged halfway. For a moment, his heart stuttered, memories flashing sharp and unwelcome. He pulled the axe free and split the log with one hard strike. Because some of us don't run, he muttered. The child frowned, sensing an answer she didn't understand, but she said nothing more. Instead, she bent to scoop another handful of snow, giggling when it spilled through her fingers. Elias turned away, but the sound tugged at something in his chest that had long lain silent. That evening, the middle sisters served a stew richer than usual. Rabbit Elias had caught, seasoned with herbs she had found near the frozen stream. When Elias took his first spoonful, he paused. It was warm, flavorful, better than anything he'd tasted in years. You cook like my mother used to, he said quietly, surprising even himself. The middle sister blinked, startled by the rare compliment. Then, almost shyly, she smiled. She must have been a good woman. Elias didn't answer. His gaze dropped to the bowl. But for the first time in years, he ate slowly, savoring the taste. Later that night, when the sisters had curled up near the fire, Elias sat at the table whittling a piece of wood. His knife worked carefully, shaping a small figure. It wasn't planned. His hands simply moved, guided by memory. The eldest noticed first. She sat up, eyes narrowing. "What are you making?" Elias didn't look up. Nothing. But when he set the carving down, it was clear. A little bird, wings tucked. Delicate and fragile. The youngest spotted it and rushed over, cradling the bird in her small hands. "It's pretty," she exclaimed. Elias shifted uneasily. "Just wood." "No," the child said firmly, hugging it to her chest. "It's a gift." The room grew still. The middle sister glanced at the eldest, who studied Elias with new eyes. For a man who had sworn solitude, who claimed trust was a lie. The carving spoke louder than words. Elias grunted and stood, pretending to busy himself with the fire. But his ears burned as the child whispered to her sisters, "He's not so mean after all." That night, sleep came slowly. Elias lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the girls' laughter, of stew that tasted like home, of the carving now clutched in small hands by the fire. He thought of the walls he had built, walls that now had cracks, and for the first time in years, Elias didn't dream of graves or betrayals. He dreamed of a table surrounded by warmth, of voices, of belonging. And when he woke, his chest ached in a way he could no longer call loneliness, but something closer to hope. Winter lingered, but the valley began to change. The snow softened, streams trickled free of ice, and the air carried the faint scent of earth beneath the frost. For weeks, the cabin had been their world, a place of survival, of caution, of slow trust. Now, with the thaw came a choice. Elias felt it first. He saw the way the eldest glanced toward the distant ridges, the way the middle sister sometimes lingered by the stream, staring at the path that led down the valley. The youngest still laughed, still played, but even she spoke of spring with a kind of longing. They had come to his door as wanderers begging shelter. They had promised labor, service, anything, if only he did not turn them away. But now they had become something more. One evening, as the fire burned low, the eldest spoke plainly. "The snow will melt soon. We can't stay forever." Her voice was steady, but Elias caught the flicker in her eyes. She wasn't eager to leave, nor eager to stay. She was torn, and she was looking to him. Elias set down the tool he had been repairing. His hands were scarred, his face lined, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in years. "You've got no village to return to," he said. No kin waiting. The middle sister's hands tightened on her lap. The youngest leaned against her, already dozing, her small wooden bird still clutched tight. The eldest nodded slowly. Then what are we, if not burdens? For the first time, Elias almost smiled, a brief, fleeting thing that softened the harsh lines of his face. You're workers, he said. You're survivors. And this place, it's big enough for more than one man's ghosts. The words settled heavy in the cabin. The middle sister blinked back sudden tears. The eldest's shoulders relaxed, the tension easing just slightly. And the youngest, half asleep, whispered, "So we can stay?" Elias looked at her, at the innocence that had melted walls he thought unbreakable. He gave a single nod. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. Not of guests waiting to leave, but of family building something lasting. The middle sister began planting herbs in small pots by the window, preparing for spring. The eldest worked alongside Elias to mend fences and check traps, their silent partnership now steady, respectful, and unspokenly equal. The youngest turned the cabin into a place of laughter, filling every corner with her songs and questions. Elias, once a man who trusted nothing and no one, found himself listening. He gave advice when asked. He let the youngest tug at his sleeve, let the middle sister fuss over his meals, let the eldest meet his gaze without fear, and when he lay in bed at night, staring at the beams above, he no longer felt the crushing weight of solitude. The silence that had once been his shield was now filled with warmth. One evening, when the snow had melted into muddy paths, Elias stepped outside and watched the sunset spill across the valley. The eldest joined him, her shawl pulled tight. "You were right," she said quietly. "About trust. It can kill." Elias glanced at her, waiting. "But it can save too," she added, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He gave a slow nod, his gaze returning to the fading light. A man alone survives, but a man with others lives. Behind them, the youngest laughed inside the cabin, and the middle sister scolded her gently. The firelight flickered through the open doorway, spilling warmth into the twilight. For the first time in years, Elias felt no urge to close the door against it. And so, in the heart of the wilderness, a family was forged, not by blood, but by choice, by survival, and by the fragile, stubborn hope that even broken souls could find belonging again.